Okay. Yeah, Jeff says that he can't think of anyone he'd rather see give this talk than me, but I can think of someone. It would be John Murray if he were available. What a beautiful quote. I have this app on my phone that whenever I'm giving a public speech and I have a time limit, it's this big font that will show me how long I've gone so I know not to speak too long. But I don't ever use the app except for when I'm speaking, and I think I gave a speech a week or two ago. So I opened up the app a few moments ago to get ready, and it was stuck at 1 hour and 53 minutes. So apparently the last speech I gave went way over, and I'm going to try not to do that tonight. For two reasons. One of them is because I care about you, and I want you to get out of here at a decent time. And the far more important reason is I care about me, and it will soon be past my bedtime. When I was in the hotel across the street a number of hours ago, I'd gotten together with some of the speakers for a bit and then went up to the room, get a little work done before dinner. And there was a little movie clip thing that was on my iPad, and I'm not sure how it had gotten there, but there was a scene in a movie the movie is actually a fantastic movie, and it's called Margin Call, and particularly for a guy who works in finance like me, I don't know if any of you see movies that ever capture the industry you work in, and if you have this tendency to nitpick all the things that are wrong about in the movie, because you know that the movie isn't really capturing the way something works, whether it's lawyers or athletes or educators or what have you. But for the world of Wall Street, these movies are not very good at reality, but they're very sensationalistic or whatever. But this movie, Margin Call, was one of the best I've ever seen at some of the realism, some of the accuracy, and it was done shortly after the big financial crisis of about 15 years ago. And anyways, the reason I bring this up, and it's relevant to our topic tonight, is this little clip that had been sent to me had a scene in which one of the main characters in the movie is being let go from this big Wall Street firm, and he has to sit down with the HR people, and they're doing the deal about we have to let you go, and you're going to get this package, and you know, all the kind of stuff, ugly thing when a big company is firing somebody. And then they say, here is, and they give a brochure. We call us in the next couple weeks so we can help you in your journey in the next package, and it's got a picture of a sailboat. And they were kind of saying to this guy who couldn't have been 52, 53 years old, you know, as you go on to the next journey, the presupposition behind this is, yes, it's sad we're firing you, but hey, maybe now you can go waste the rest of your life. Okay? Now, they don't mean that. And all the commercials on television that describe some smiling couple on the beach holding hands, talking about starting a vineyard, they don't mean that condescendingly, but that is the message. The message is a celebration of inactivity. And this cultural message is why I wrote the book full time that Jeff alluded to earlier. And so because I happen to know, David said a moment ago that Providence is a specifically Reformed college. And I grew up in the Reformed church. I am a Reformed person, and I'm well aware when I'm speaking to different audiences that sometimes I've spoken to Catholic audiences, broadly evangelical, sometimes a mostly unsaved audience, and sometimes there's a lot of people that have a certain Reformed distinctive in the audience, and it's not necessary for those of you in the audience as you're listening right now, it's not necessary for you to have come from that background or to hold to those distinctives to be able to kind of process what I'm about to say, but there is a little different twist. I put on my message, this is roughly the 150th talk I've given since this book came out, and it's a little different twist when I'm speaking to an audience that shares a lot of the reformational theology distinctives. And the reason is that there is no audience and no camp, world, ecosystem, clique, faction of the Christian world, of society, of the different domains that I have a membership card in, There's none that's supposed to know better and that seems to know worse. And this is my honest biographical assessment of vocational theology in the Reformed world. That does say every square inch, that does say Kuyper, that does say Calvin, that does say Lordship, that means it and has a certain degree of application in a number of the spheres and domains of life. But when it comes to the marketplace, either oftentimes gets it wrong or ignores it altogether. There are a whole lot of issues that many of you in the room may be animated by in the state of affairs in which we live, politically, culturally. There are matters of sexual ethics, medical ethics. I myself am devoting my life to the domain of economics, entrepreneurialism, and a rigorous defense of the marketplace and what all that means for the cause of human flourishing. Everybody is animated by different things because God made us all individually. My belief is not that every Christian is supposed to go take on every issue. There's a lot of issues that I have opinions on and care about that I'm not as animated by as I am this one. But the fact of the matter is, I did not become animated by the message of full-time work and the meaning of life because of the secular culture's message about work. That movie scene I alluded to, Margin Call, the example I've given in most of the speeches I've given around the country, if my wife is with me, I always use, she's not here tonight, but if she is, I always use Hallmark movies because she and I watch these things together around the holidays just to try to sacrifice some extra brain cells that we want to get rid of. And the Hallmark message I allude to is always one that are, reasonably innocuous and innocent movies, but the message is really very clear. There is somebody who's working too hard, really in their career. And then at a real snowy, adorable time of year in a small town, they go back and they're going to work to save the town fire station. And they're going to get back together with the ex-girlfriend from high school, and they're going to leave that stinking job behind and get on with the important things in life. And as a matter of sitting on the couch with a fire watching the movie with my wife in December, it's lovely. As a matter of Christian theology, it's about as bad as it gets. And this is unfortunately a version of a message that is not limited to Hallmark, Hollywood, and even much of the kind of big media world of pop culture. It's a message that in a slightly different version comes from pulpits in churches all the time. That our work is instrumental at best, an evil temptation, and something that every other aspect of our life is in combat with. This message, in fairness, and to be as charitable as I can be, is sometimes implicit. And I need to attack it because when it's latent, it's still a problem. But this message is sometimes not implicit. It's sometimes just explicitly said. Yes, go to work, do the job thing, but you're focused, you're called to be a family man, or to be a mother, or some other element of church service. And I believe, you can write this down if any of you are taking notes, but this is going to be very controversial. I believe you're supposed to do both. That's the end of my talk. I believe that we are being described a false dilemma that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in Scripture. And it doesn't exist in Scripture for the reason I'm going to talk to you about tonight, which is that we operate out of reading the Scripture and understand certain things about our vocational activity, about work in the marketplace, about those various endeavors we have. We understand them, if we are Christians, rooted to a world and life view of Christianity that begins in Genesis chapter 1. Now, this is very true about the topic tonight. I am going to root my teachings on work in Genesis chapter 1. But if I were giving a talk tonight about family, if I were giving a talk tonight about the human person, about human nature, about anthropology, if I were giving a talk tonight about any discipline or field that requires some foundational understandings, creational norms start with creation. Genesis chapter 1, going into the second chapter, leaves absolutely no doubt about the things that are, for whatever reason, considered in many evangelical and yes, even Reformed circles that I'm going to say tonight to be controversial. But they're not controversial because all I'm going to do is tell you what God said. And the first thing I'm going to say is that before God made us, and before God told us why He made us, and before I get the exegetical support for the case I want to make about our earthly endeavors and what we call work, there are 25 verses that start off the first chapter of Genesis. I do assume that many of you in the audience tonight have read Genesis 1, and there's even a good chance that a lot of you frequently reread it. I don't know your Bible reading habits. There's some passages in the Bible that I've read many, many times in my life and then go a while without reading, and when I get to go back and revisit, I'm always kind of blown away. I'm an extreme sucker for the book of Romans. I don't go very long without reading over that quite a bit. And Genesis 1's another chapter. I've read it a lot. But if you go a certain period of time without reading it, I strongly suggest you go back and just reread it because it's majestic. It's just a beautiful chapter. And I don't mean merely in the imagery, but I do mean that. In the beauty, but I do mean that. But in the basic instruction manual of what we're understanding about our purpose as to what exactly we're here to do. These are existential questions that tug at the heart and mind of man. And Genesis 1 provides a beautiful marination of this biblical message. But in the first 25 verses, God describes himself making the world day by day. And it is done in this sequence where we get a chance to hear God at the end of the day, having made the oceans, say it is good. And having made the sun, moon, and stars, and saying it's good. And then after 25 verses, there's sort of grammatically, if you will, parenthetically, a bit of a break or a segue or a shift. And then he says, let us make man in our own image. And he did say something else, just to sidebar for a second culturally. He says, male and female, let us make them. Now that has become an extremely controversial comment, but I digress. And then he goes on to say what he made us for. And one of the most oft quoted verses, especially, by the way, in Reformed circles that have a very healthy view of family and procreation. It's certainly uttered a lot in Catholic circles, so they have a healthy view of procreation, is that we are to multiply and fill the earth. And it then goes on, in the passage that is often referred to as the cultural mandate, it describes the dominion over the earth and the dominion over the other processes in the earth and the other creatures of the earth and the task given to mankind for cultivation and for stewardship. And I'm not at all afraid of the word dominion. I think dominion is a perfectly appropriate word in the context of it. But for those that might want to load that word a little differently than is needed for our context tonight, I am just simply saying that there are a series of verbs that are used that describe mankind having this useful and productive activity. But 4 times in 2 verses, in this little middle ground portion, Genesis 1, it says that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that we are made in God's image, that we are made as image bearers of God. And I honestly believe if I happened to have been raised in a Christian home and I had a Reformed pastor as a dad, and I honestly believe that a lot of Christians hear the term their whole life, you're made in the image of God. And I'm not sure that everyone has stopped to ask what that means. Because I think it's really easy to know what it doesn't mean. And you know, J.I. Packer talked about we basically are hopefully familiar with the idea that there's attributes we share with God and attributes we don't. And when I look at the omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence of God, I've never thought, oh, as an image bearer of God, I have that. I can know everything. I can do everything. We know that that's not what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. But what does it mean? When we understand the elevated dignity that God made us with and the elevated responsibility and the particularity of task in those verses where it is said 4 times in 2 verses, the incredibly unavoidable context is that our image-bearing status is relevant to our responsibility to go work and take care of the world and to grow the world. And as much as I will compliment my Reformed friends, my Catholic friends that understand the procreative extraction of Genesis 1:26, I am sorry to tell you that that is not all that verse says. It does say that being fruitful, multiply, fill the earth involves bearing children. But the idea that God was telling us to go fill the earth with children and not build roads or systems of moving supplies or creating beautiful things or having this sort of development of civilization, a basic economic activity, economic infrastructure, human cooperation together, what we would refer to as a marketplace. It's an unavoidable consequence of being fruitful, multiplying, and filling the earth. And then again, through 27 and 28, this cultivation, stewardship, dominion, directly connected to our image-bearing status. And then back to the first 25 verses where these various components on each day of creation are good, 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 and good, 5 days in a row. He makes mankind and says it was very good in verse 31 of Genesis chapter 1. The only part of the creation account described as very good. I'm unable to do economics without commitments to what I believe about the human person. By the way, nobody is able to do economics without commitments that they have about the human person. It's just that some people's beliefs about the human person are wrong and some are right. And I recommend, if you're trying to understand economics, to go with the person who is right. You can write that part down too if you want. What God told us is that mankind was different than the rest of creation. Now, I know that we have souls that can never die. And I know that there is an interiority to mankind that is different than the animal kingdom. There are certain instinctive abilities in animals to survive. There is no capacity to thrive. That distinction is very important spiritually. We do not, the animal kingdom in the jungle gets its prey so it can eat. And it will move on to the next meal when it is hungry again. And that is the basic impulsive behavior of survival. And that is the limit of the non-image bearing part of creation called the animal kingdom. What we have is an ability to create beauty, to see and appreciate beauty, and to engage in communion with God. And in such communion, before sin entered the world, because we're still in Genesis 1, and original sin has not happened yet, but we have the ability to be in relationship with God and to do so in the capacity as workers in the earth He created. It is not merely that the Bible starts here, that the world starts here, creation starts here, and hopefully by my general theological point that our understanding of theology needs to start with creation. But because so much of what we necessarily have to understand as believers ends up then really moving to the doctrine of the fall, and consequently the doctrine of redemption and what it means for God to redeem these things back to himself. It's incredibly important to understand what we're being restored to and what God's design for us. Because if I make an argument for something humans ought to do or used to do or maybe ought to consider doing, and it's rooted to something that was very specifically not part of God's creative plan, but was a necessary and unfortunate byproduct of sin, there's a deficiency in that argument. And over and over and over again, I have heard believers say that work was a byproduct of sin, that work was something that came from the curse. And the reason I want you to appreciate this context of Genesis 1 and on into Genesis 2, still before original sin, Genesis chapter 2:15, elaborating now specifically talking to Adam and Eve about their responsibility to shamar the garden, to serve, to steward, the same verb used describing shepherds taking care of their flock, and then to avodah, the work, which is the same Hebrew word used in the fourth commandment, 6 days thou shalt work and do all thy labor. And it is used hundreds of times in the Hebrew text, at least the Hebrew prefix avo, in reference to work and worship. All of this is before sin. And this creative capacity and this design God had for the world, where we would be in communion with him, God with us, this Emmanuel relationship between God and man. This is the most beautiful story in the world because this is the story of the world. And it was a relationship based on God creating us to go do things, to go be productive, to go be active. I don't know what happened that this message gets missed so often. But I believe that we, of all people who understand some version of a worldview of Christianity, that understand the creational normatives and their relevance to our life, and even understand in the doctrine of the fall the powerful message of redemption and what it means that God's grace is restoring his designs for the world. But I believe, and I mentioned earlier that the app I use to keep track of my time, I always hold up an iPhone when I say this part because it's the one consumer device that I strongly suspect every one of you has in your pocket right now. Most successful, popular consumer product in world history. There's not a single thing in that phone that didn't exist at the Garden of Eden. Nothing. All the iPhone is the raw materials of the world that were made ex nihilo by God, and then that mankind made out of nature with ideas, Amen. Ingenuity, the creative, brilliant genius that a giraffe doesn't have, but that God made us to have, to produce goods and services that enhance the quality of life, to have our needs met by meeting the needs of others, to create new things, and this side of the fall, to do so recognizing that sinful nature has polluted and corrupted so much of the created order, and that we have a responsibility to go demonstrate righteousness, and that is in the domain of our family, our relationship at our church, our activities in our community, but in our created purpose of working. When we pit work, as sermons often do, as something hostile to family and hostile to church and hostile to service of God, first of all, if someone just says, well, David, you can't deny there may be people, if someone's working all the time, they're ignoring their family. They may work all the time and never go to church. They may work all the time and not be a good member of their community or engaged in other activities. That's most certainly true, but I just simply want to ask, how many of you ever hear any other thing pitted against any other thing? It's only work. And that term that I hate more than anything, the only reason I like it is it helps me end certain job interviews very, very quickly, is work-life balance. This heretical apostasy of cultural millennial garbage. Other than that, it's fine. Work-life balance. Tell me one other idiom, cliche, euphemism, expression, popularized, that flows off the tongue, that requires us to balance something in our life. It doesn't exist. And I've made this joke countless times. I still think it's funny. Jolene does not think it's that funny anymore, but I don't think people go home after work and say, I'm sorry, honey, I can't talk right now. I'm doing marriage-life balance. It's just not a good look. Over and over and over again, we have decided, well, I want a work-life balance. And this is not to say that I want someone who doesn't do anything in their life but work. It's to say that the language is suggesting that our work and our life are in tension. You balance two things that are in tension with one another. And the time you spend at work is in tension with the time you spend with family. But your life is not in tension with your work. Your work is a purpose of your life. And your family is not something that you have to figure out what the priorities are. This pietistic drivel that it goes God, then family, then church, then work. That may sound adorable. And if I were an ordained pastor, I can't make fun of it the way I am now, because you're supposed to say stuff like that. But it isn't true. It's not in the Bible, and I'm not going to say it. It's God. And you know what God cares about in the order of your life? If we are whole Bible Christians, worldview oriented, if we are Kuyperian, if we believe in every square inch, if we are, can I say it, Calvinist, He cares about your work and your church and your family and your community activities and your hobbies, all of it. Every square inch means every square inch. And it does not mean the one that, by the way, happens to be the thing that's going to drive the fund request for their building fund, that one is the least important one. We've reduced our work to a utilitarian component. It's necessary to feed your family, and in fact, it's even good to do that. And in fact, it's even sinful not to do that. Well, good. We got that part down. It's not enough. It is also not enough to say you need to faithfully tithe from your work, that from the fruits of your labor you will support church ministry, and then we can get some really important things done. That is not true. It is dualist. Taken to the wrong extreme, it can become heretical. The work is important because what is being done is important inherently as part of God's creation, starting with the worker, him or herself. God cares about the worker, cares about the individuality, the skills, the talents, the capabilities, the hopes, the dreams, the failures, that all represent what we do in our endeavor, and that God cares about it so much that it is part of our very identity as people. I do not believe I'm giving a message tonight, and I don't imagine any of you are hearing it this way, that says, your work is more important than your family, and I strongly encourage you to stop paying so much attention to your family. And if I were going to say that, it would be a night like tonight where my family's not here, but I'm not going to say it. And I've said this time and time again. I love my kids. I have 2 or 3 of them, and I think they're all whatever, wonderful. But I'm going to close tonight and go to Q&A by quoting one of the most extraordinary members of my family that I've ever known, who was himself a Reformed minister, my late father. Because I'm in this position, as I do hope and pray many of you are, where there's a lot of things to love about my dad, a lot of memories, a lot of good attributes. And that's a positive thing to have. When you have the loss of a loved one, you want to have a lot of things to remember. He was so good this way, he was so funny, or this or that. And my dad had just a tremendous amount of positive attributes. But, it's not 30 years yet, but he's been gone close to 30 years, and I turned 50 a couple months ago, and you reflect on this stuff a lot. When I lost my dad when I was 20 years old, you reflect on this stuff as you get older. And I got to tell you, as I was writing this book, it was abundantly clear to me that one of the most underrated things I love about my dad was how much he worked. And to the extent that any father loves their children, I believe one of the great, and I say father because I'm a father and I'm talking about my own father. This is not important in terms of the gender and the roles and that stuff. It's not what I'm getting at. One of the most important things a dad can do for their kids is show them that they love their work. And I don't blame people for every now and then accidentally saying it. I suspect when I was younger, my kids are younger, it may have come out of my mouth a little bit too. I don't really remember. But I think most people have said something to the extent of, how dare you take that for granted? Don't you know I work all day so you can have that? You know, my work pays for that meal. My work bought us this house. You know, have gratitude, eat your food, those types of things. And all of it's true that our labors produce these material components that our families enjoy. But it's never been true that I did those things for the purpose of the food in the house and the shelter. I did them because God made me to produce goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, to produce, create, and innovate, because the God I worship was a producer, a creator, and an innovator. My dad modeled that for me. It was in a very different field, but it was a legacy I take very seriously, and in thought and in deed. And I believe that when it comes to the way we reconcile the responsibilities and sometimes burdens and tensions of work with family, I am very sorry to tell you that it is not formulaic. And if it were, the entire book of Proverbs can be thrown out of the Bible. It requires wisdom. And when people will say, well, okay, it sounds like I'm supposed to have a higher view of work, but my family matters. How much time? What time do I have to leave? How many nights a week for dinner? What time in the morning? Who does pickup? And this and every family's dynamic is different. The specific seasons of life are different. There's so many different components there. It can't be formalized. It can't be compartmentalized. It requires wisdom. But it absolutely is true that God cares about what we contribute to our churches, to our families, to our communities, and that our standing, our efforts, our primary endeavor with our time is most likely going to be in our vocational endeavors in the marketplace. And therefore, we have an opportunity to not only live out our calling, our skills, our passions, we have the responsibility to go co-create with God as He made us to do. This, to me, is one of the most exciting messages you could ever hear in church or on a Friday night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.